Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Friends of the Georgetown Library Tuesdays with lecture series. We're beginning the second half of our year now. We go September through May, and really glad to have you here in this new year. Happy New Year to everyone. And this is exciting with a great turnout as we begin our new year, and excited about what we've got coming up in the months ahead, which we'll talk about later. But today, we're thrilled to have with us Jim Lee on our series of Tuesdays with. We make reference to that title to a book that came out in 1997, Tuesdays with Maury. And that's why we call this, so today is Tuesdays with Jim Lee. And the connection on that is the fact that that book tells a wonderful story about a relationship between a university professor and a student that went well beyond those 4 years of the college experience and continued into the adult years. And that's what our series is all about, is the opportunity to be able to continue to learn, in particular about Georgetown and what we have here in Georgetown, which is so rich in heritage, particularly in both nature as well as history. And today we've got the outstanding representative of those two fields of history and nature in having Jim Lee with us. He's at the Yawkey Center, as I'm sure all of you know, which is the reason you're here. You're not here to hear me, you're here to hear Jim. But it's just a thrill to be able to have Jim with us. It was a year ago that Jim did another presentation on the impact of the Yawkey family here in Georgetown County. An excellent presentation that is available on the library's YouTube page. And if you didn't get a chance to hear that last year, wonderful presentation on what the Yawkey family impact was here. And when he finished that, oh, incidentally, it's over 500 views of that. You're almost, what do they call that when it's mega, what is it? It's gone viral? Yeah, it's gone viral. It's up to 500. But it is an excellent presentation. But when Jim finished that last year, he said, as he finished that presentation, he said, I just finished another presentation you might be interested on rice culture. I said, you're signed up for next January. So what's the next one?
We don't know yet, but yeah.
Anyway, join me in welcoming Jim Lee.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, friends of the library. And got a lot of friends here, you know. Giving a talk in front of people you don't know is unnerving as heck, but I see a lot of friends and a lot of people have come from different places to share in this story with us today. And I hope this information is something that you can take with you and share with others that you encounter. So if you haven't met me before, my name is Jim Lee, and I'm here representing the Department of Natural Resources. When I started with them 40 years ago, it was just the Wildlife Department, and so they've updated the name just a little bit. This is actually what I looked like, Fred. This is 35 years ago or so. And I, like you, perhaps had hair on the top of our head, right? And I worked with a lot of fantastic people along the way and seen some really fantastic places, and fortunate enough to have a camera with me a lot of the time and take some photographs along the way. One of those that was with me for many of my years with DNR was Mr. Phil Wilkinson, who's up here on the front row with us today. And I spent the greater part of that first 30 years as part of the Waterfowl Project and managing those ancient rice fields, working with the wetlands, taking people out to enjoy the bounty of all that. It was a joyful season in my life, but eventually I began to kind of transition over into doing some educational things and became the department's liaison with that wildlife forestry program over at Horry Georgetown Technical College. And that was a lot of fun. And so I figured if I could do that, well, maybe I could expand and start reaching out to some different groups and sharing some other historic features and natural history around the county. And end up being offered an opportunity to share the same sort of programming with folks at the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center, where I spend many of my days on the short bus, but it's okay because I'm driving the short bus, okay? So, and I tell you all that just to let you know I didn't crawl out from underneath a rock somewhere, okay? So today we're going to talk about rice and wetlands and waterfowl. And I want to go ahead and let you know right now, this is not the complete story about rice history or waterfowl or wetlands. This is an unfinished story. It's my belief that there are many more chapters to come, and we can explore that as well. I hope that as we conclude the presentation that we have a few moments for some questions and comments. If you don't want to do it in that sort of format, if you want to talk off camera, I'm going to hang around for a little while. I've got some books back there I'd love to tell you about. I got some books up here I'd like to share with you. This is a library. Believe it or not, I spend a fair amount of time here. I think I know almost everybody in here. So it's a good place to hang out. So if you're here on a Tuesday morning, congratulations, a good place to be. So let's consider early explorers to South Carolina. They came by boat and they explored the coastline by the rivers. And so their rendition of the way our coastline looks focuses on all these rivers along the coast of both North and South Carolina. And if you looked at it from an overview, this is what you see. And if you fly down the coast, this is what you see is wetlands, rivers, creeks, swamps, forested wetlands, grassy wetlands, freshwater wetlands, saltwater wetlands, wetlands. What good is a bunch of wetlands? To some people, those early arrivals and people that come later on, they said, what good is this place? It's just all wet and swamp and marsh everywhere. You can't do anything with that. Well, some people disagreed with that notion. And one of those guys was a gentleman named John Lawson. And he visits South Carolina in the winter of 1700 and embarks on an epic journey. He would travel more than 1,000 miles, beginning just to our south here. And I've got a copy of his book up here. I'll just share this one with you right now. This is one of my gospels that I carry around and refer to all the time. If you want to understand what early South Carolina was like, you need to have this in your library. Great insights on the flora, the fauna, the soils, the rocks, and the people that made up South Carolina in 1700. Just a glorious thing to look at and to get his impressions. He found South Carolina to be one of the most wonderful places on earth he had ever visited, and he was a well-traveled man. He describes that first stretch along the coastline as he came into the Santee River, paddled by canoe upstream as an endless maze of cypress swamp. And he said it looked the same for days, just unrecognizable where you were from day to day. It would have been in full flood, Phil, when you traveled through, and even his Indian guides who were familiar with it found themselves bewildered at points because of the width and the depth of this immense forest. And he also describes a South Carolina that many of us wouldn't be familiar with, a South Carolina that featured great herds of buffalo, herds of elk, things that we don't see in South Carolina anymore. This is 1700, and South Carolina would change a lot in the years that follow, and it changes very quickly as well. He also describes the people of South Carolina, the Native Americans, and the Native Americans that would have been around Georgetown County, the Waccamaws, the Winyaws, the Sewees, and the Santees, and all of these people making great use of the natural wetlands, and I want to show you exactly where they lived. If you look at this map, this is coastal South Carolina in 1600, and if you see all along the coastline here, where are people living? Along these rivers, along these marshes. They're taking full advantage of all these wetland features. This is where the greatest abundance of natural resources were occurring, and they made good use of all this. Today, you can go out on many of our beaches and strands and shell banks and such and find numerous artifacts left behind by these people. They're here for millennia and making great use of these places. You see shells that they would have harvested. You see pieces of pottery, and I think that might even be a piece of bone right there. We won't even go where that piece of bone might have come from, but these things are all over our coastline, which tells us that these people are here for a long time and made a really rich living out of it. One of the resources that they used, rice, wild rice. was abundant resource for millennia along the coast of South Carolina, and this photograph was taken fairly recently along some of our freshwater tidal wetlands, and you see lots and lots of this wild rice growing up in here. If you look at it more closely, producing a great amount of this natural resource on every single stalk, and all of this is available. I've actually gone out and harvested wild rice along our tidal wetlands, and much the same way that Native Americans did it. You pull your canoe up into that stand of wild rice, and you bend those fronds over into the boat and shake them, or you can rake them with the paddle that you've paddled in with, and that rice will fall in the bottom of the boat, and you can gather it up. And if you work at it hard for a few hours, you'll get a good handful. I'm not as good as Native Americans at harvesting rice, but you can actually gather that rice. You let it dry, you can mill it. It's really tasty, but it takes an awful lot of work to get there, which lets me know these Native Americans were hard-working folks. But wild rice is distinctly different from many of the rice products that we're familiar with today. Even if you eat healthy brown rice, you're still not getting as good a product as these Native Americans were getting here. Very high in protein, omega-3s, omega-6s. This is a bona fide superfood. And not only were Native Americans consuming it, but waterfowl. And for millennia, migratory waterfowl using the wetlands of coastal South Carolina and relying, at least in part, on all of this wild rice that was available. Phil, I've opened up birds when I was with the Waterfowl Project in late winter and discovered their craw would just be full of these wild rice seeds. The seeds had fallen off the plant perhaps months earlier, but it's lodged in the mud underneath. And on the tide, the birds just swim through and they dip down and pick up these rice seeds because they recognize how valuable they are as well. So rice has always been a real big part of our coast here. Rice, also a big part of the culture of Western Africa. And the people that live along this part of Western Africa, the Gambia, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, down to Conakry, enjoyed the benefits of rice for millennia, about 3,000 years worth. And just for the record, they are the people that bring rice to North America. We don't get Asian rice, we get African rice. What's the difference? African rice is much more nutritious than the Asian rice that would later replace it here. And this is well documented. You know, there's a great story about the seed from Madagascar, which tells about a very romantic tale, a sea captain that comes into Charleston with this rice seed that came from Asia, and he picked it up in Madagascar, and somebody down in Charleston starts growing it. No, the genetic record has proven definitely that it was African rice that comes to North America first, and then later on is replaced by Asian rice, which is not nearly as nutritious, nor was it nearly as able to withstand some of the conditions, the pest, insects, drought, salinity. The red rice, that African rice that comes over, was much, much better suited for our soils and our conditions here. This is what the west coast of Africa looks like on those lowlands down there. In other words, it looks just like our place, okay? And it was very well suited for the production of rice. The people that come over here enslaved are experts in preparing the land, in growing this crop and cultivating and milling. They know more about it than anybody else in this vicinity, and a lot of this is just back-breaking work. It was the same work in Africa that it was here. Really, really tough. And not surprising to learn that the African women are the brains of this operation. And they would pass along the knowledge of which seed to grow in which part of that tidal gradient and which type of soil on to their daughters. And this is the way this rice culture is perpetuated for centuries. And many of the more enlightened plantation owners would allow these blacks to kind of formulate how the crop would be grown, how the task on each plantation would be allocated based on the way that they did it in Africa, because this was the most efficient way. They'd been doing it like this for a long time. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Pretty good way to operate like that. Without that African influence, it is doubtful that rice would become near the mainstay of our economy and also later our ecology without the contributions of that West African culture. And think about it as well, these people didn't just bring rice over here, and they just didn't bring strong backs to work the land and make all this magic happen. They bring a lot of the food, a lot of the music that we enjoy in our culture today. We've forgotten how that all came upon us. But this is where it comes from. It's these people from Western Africa who bring all of this rice culture that we share today as Southern traditions, okay? This is where it all comes from, or where much of it comes from. And much like their forebears, what they had to do when they got here is first remove this cypress forest that dominates these freshwater tidal wetlands, all of these cypress trees, and some of them were little trees and just hundreds and hundreds, per acre. And then some of them were huge, big enough that you could get inside them, big as a house by some descriptions. And so it was a vast undertaking. All of this work being done by hand, it's just incredible. If I sent one of you out to cut one tree like that and then told you to cut the stump down 2 feet below the ground, you wouldn't be able to complete the task, even fathom how to complete the task. But this is done over and over and over again. It's just an incredible feat that they were able to accomplish. Typically, the way they would do this, you'd first go into these wetland areas, remove the trees, right? Take care of all those trees and stumps by hand, and then you build an embankment. And it starts up here on the mainland and extends out to the riverfront and around and back up to the mainland. And you take out the tide in that tidal marsh. And then you would go in and you would create a sub-component of that and install a rice trunk, a way to manage the water going in and out of that one section. And once you had established it in rice, now you're creating income. Now you've got the money and resources to build yet another one inside that original embankment. And you do this over and over until you've got a myriad of rice fields in there, constantly creating new fields. And then once you have a number of fields like this, you can leave a section out each year, let it rest, and then produce rice in the others, and then move that system around like that. It was absolutely ingenious. And Phil, a real good example of how they did this up on Springfield Plantation. This is Samworth, and we'll talk about Samworth and Mr. Samworth a little bit later on. But over here, this is Springfield. And you can see this same situation here. They built a dike from the mainland out around this big curve in the river, back to the mainland, and then section by section by section by section by section by section, put it under control and began to produce rice on it year after year after year. It didn't always work exactly that way because they used these lands out here that were surrounded by water as well, where there was no mainland to attach your embankment to. Phil, you probably recognize this as Lower Middleton, at one time part of Bannockburn Plantation, and an extensive and complex series of wetlands. So the idea just gets enlarged. And you can see, if you look at an aerial photograph of Georgetown County's wetlands, every square inch of these freshwater tidal wetlands devoted to rice culture, and much of that infrastructure, the dikes and canals that they built, still visible today. Phil, I can tell you with great certainty, I have probably walked more of that piece of ground right there than any other person alive in this county today. So very, very familiar with that one. I think I could do it blindfolded, in fact. But once you had the land under control, you had to begin to work that land. And instead of doing all of that just by manpower, they enlisted the power of animals as well. So mules and oxen, and the soils on these delta soils, on these delta lands, not suitable for mechanized equipment really. And even the mules that worked the land, they were fitted with these little shoes. And that kept them from sinking down into that mud and allowed them to get a little bit more leverage as they moved through that landscape. One of the reasons that rice culture ends in Georgetown County is because these soils wouldn't support mechanized equipment. And throughout my career, we've challenged this concept on a regular basis. And you see the result, okay? So these people weren't just kidding. It's not getting any better out there. So in order to grow rice, you've had to clear all the trees and stumps. You've had to build these earthen dikes and install water control structures. Now all you do is add water, right? The whole concept of growing wet rice is this addition of water throughout the growing season. And you had the sprout flow, the point flow, the long water, the lay-by water. Everything was done with water. Let's say you got your rice crop coming along real good, about yay high, and all of a sudden there's an invasion of armyworms. What's a farmer to do? You add water to it. You drown the little rascals. The way they treated weeds, they would draw the water down. They would go in and chop up the weeds by hand and let those weeds dry out in the sun for a few days. Then they would add water. The dead weeds rise to the top of the water on a breezy day. All of that debris transported over to one end of the field, and they simply scooped it up out of the way. It was ingenious, all the things you could do just by managing the water. And this gets into the part that perhaps I'm most familiar with, is the technology involved with managing water, these water control structures, and some of them are very, very simple. In one particular application, they take a long log and they would simply saw off a third or so of that log. And then with what remains, they would carve what looks like a trough into it. After they'd completed that, you could take that slab that you sawed off, put it right back on top, or you could install planks on top of that, and now you've got a trunk, right? And you could put a plug in either end of it, and this would be called a plug trunk. This is the very simplest form of water control that they use, perhaps to move water from one of those sections we talked about to another. This gets more and more complex as you go through time, and many, many revisions to this early technology. The French, the Scots, the English were used to harnessing tidal power, and they're pretty good at what they do. But the Africans, remember, they're the ones that bring the rice culture, so they have to marry all of these cultures together to get an operational structure that everyone could use. One of the plug trunks that they found along Social Hall plantations lands. Phil, I found this just absolutely ingenious. And I'm going to build a model of one of these down at the Yawkey Center so people can come and see how this technology evolves over time. When you got ready to install one of the trunks, you dig a hole in the earth. And remember, this is a tidal area, right? So you got water coming back and forth. You have to move at a rather feverish pace to get first the box installed underneath the bank, and then install what they call a revetment here, a bulkhead across it, and then these puncheons that are driven down into the mud to make this thing waterproof, all the while people in the background refilling this hole and trying to do all that on a single tide, sometimes a Herculean task. Like I said, this technology advances as we go through time, beginning in the 1720s. By 1820, they've moved a long ways with it. And still remnants of some of these old rice field trunks, the water control structures, visible out in the marshes today. Phil, this was down at Santee Coastal Reserve in the 1920s. And you can see this is an old age structure, still getting some life out of it because of the materials that it was built out of. And you still see pieces of that heart pine construction sticking up out of the marsh. Fred, this was down at Yawkey. You've seen this before on the bus with us. Then there was a fella in the 1960s who realized the need to standardize water control structures that were being used now not to grow rice, but to manage those same wetlands that they had grown rice in for migratory waterfowl and for other wetland-dependent species. The fella that makes this little drawing right here, which shows the installation and the construction of these components, was none other than Phil Wilkinson, who happens to be in our presence on the front row. And thank you, Phil. So the design that Phil follows is that which was perfected by 1820 by all of the French, the Scots, the English, and the Africans, and whoever else came into that picture along the way. It was the culmination of all of that work that made something that was just about perfect. And that's the model that we're still using today. And I can tell you that with my 30 years on the waterfowl project, we had a number of people that thought they would bring improvements to this model. All of those improvements failed, and we go right back to this model that was standardized by 1820 and resurrected by Wilkinson in the 60s. To get those trunks from where they were built to where they were installed, they would have used a rice barge. And yes, Julie, this does come from your collection, by the way, so thank you, yeah. And thanks to the people that donated it so we can educate the public and show them what this was like. This is probably turn of the century or so. So long past times when people thought rice had ended, still using the same technology, still growing rice on those same lands. Now, we come to the present. We're still using a lot of that same technology today. We've got some changes here that makes it a little bit easier. Heavy machinery to load that trunk onto a barge and take it to where it's installed. We build our own trunks, build the boxes in the shop or right outside the doors of the shop. And then once they're completed, they can be moved, they can be trucked, they can be put on a barge. In some cases, you would just build the box and the uprights separately, fit them together, dry fit them, then take it back in parts so you can got components that can lay flat on a truck or on a barge, get underneath arbor of trees, etc., and then put it together when you get on the site. And kind of neat to be able to kind of recreate all of that as you go through time. Putting one of these trunks in a hole is not a pleasant day's work. I don't know how it worked out like this, Alec. I seem to always put them in the summertime, and that's not when rice planters did it. They did it in the wintertime. That's when you weren't harvesting rice or cultivating rice, and you had to water down in the field. They did it in the wintertime. We're not as smart as they were, so we did ours in the summertime. And it's pretty tough. Mud and sweat and tears involved. Interestingly, this is a diorama at the Rice Museum, and many of you live here have seen this. Maybe it's been a few years. But I want you to kind of get an idea of what this looked like. That was, according to the diorama, 1842 or something. Here's what it looks like today. Back then, today, I don't see a whole lot of difference, but I can tell you this, those guys that did it in the 1840s are a lot stronger and probably a lot smarter than the people that are doing it today. So they knew the why of everything they were doing. Some of the people doing it today, they just do it because this is what they're told to do. So pretty neat to see how that evolves over time. Well, just, for instance, I'm not saying anything about the individuals here, but these guys got 10 years experience at most installing, building these structures. Those Africans in 1840 had 3,000 years of experience doing it. Do the math. It's real simple like that, isn't it? But this is the finished product. And these are all over the low country today. Anywhere you go, Santee Coastal Reserve probably has about 90 of these. I think the Yawkey Center, close to 90 up at Samworth on the PD, 36 last time I checked, water control structures. So these things are everywhere. Of course, we're not managing for rice anymore. We're managing these wetlands for migratory birds, in particular waterfowl, but also shorebirds and all the other wetland-dependent species. So eagles and alligators and beavers and bobcats, everything that's a part of that world, benefiting from our ability to manage the wetlands, to manipulate the water levels, to get the crops to grow that are beneficial to all these species that use them. And to perpetuate this way of knowledge that comes from the Africans and those early European planters, I build models, and then these are awarded to individuals over time. I've sold a few, but most of them were awarded as like a conservation appreciation or something like that. and using that same methodology, but just on a smaller scale. All those old rice trunks are pegged together, and that's the way I build my little models, such as one you see on the table right there. And to perpetuate that science and that art that went along with that process. Let's get back to growing rice, all right? You've done an awful lot of work just to get to the point where you've got these little seedlings coming up. But you got a long ways to go before you get any of this product out of the field into a mill or processed so that it can be sold later on. A lot of the market for rice is actually in Europe, and it's a long, long ways by sailing ship to Europe from those rice fields. By the time you get it to this stage, it's late August and September. This, as we know it, is hurricane season. And it didn't take much of a blow to reduce your rice. Your income for the entire year could disappear in one night. So there's a lot of prayer, I think, that goes into this process. And if the gods are benevolent, then you've got a harvest that looks like this, and you've got to get out there and get it out of the field before these little guys get there. These are bobolinks, or what they called rice birds. And they timed their migration just perfectly. Just before the rice was ready to harvest is when they were ready to eat. And many people were employed on each individual rice field to keep the rice birds of the bobolinks at bay until the rice could be harvested. Harvesting the rice. I'm sure it was hard work, but at last you get to see your products coming out of that rice field. And they cut it in the field and wrapped it up in big bundles and then carried it out as much as one person could shoulder at a time. And in those early days of rice production, they had what they called a flail stick. It would be a long pole, perhaps longer than this, and a little strap attached up here, then another shorter rod at the end of that. And you simply flipped it back and then down on the ground where those rice stalks are laying, and that dislodged the seed from the stalk. Once you've dislodged the seed from the stalk, you got to get that outer hull off of it, okay? As you can't get it to market, it would have looked just like this stuff right here. Take a close look at this. This is Carolina gold rice before you leave. But you got to get that outer hull off. And so what the times they would do, they would take it up into what they called a winnowing house. And this is a photograph shared with me by Gary Edgar, great photographer around here. This is a photograph of the same structure. This is on Mansfield Plantation. As far as I know, Phil, this is the only intact rice winnowing house in the country. And this is a fairly fantastic structure to go see. Give them a call if you're interested. They'll probably let you come down and take pictures of the outside of it, as they did for me. But they carried the rice up to this top floor on a breezy day. And then there's a grate in the floor, and they have a piece of metal grate across this, and they rake those rice grains across that grate, and as that stuff falls through, that now loosened hull goes away with the wind, and what you're left with on the ground is what they called rough rice. That's what we would call brown rice. It still has that bran layer attached to it. Good, healthy stuff to eat, but this is not what the market was after. They wanted polished rice, white rice, and this was the demand over in Europe in particular, where a lot of our Georgetown County rice ended up. There were still people around in the 1920s and 30s. This is down at Santee Coastal, Phil, right down there in the barnyard. And these young men are using this time-honored tradition of pounding the rice in the mortar and pestle to loosen up that outer hull as well. And there's one of these back in the little history room back here in the library. Go take a look at how big that thing is. And imagine, this is a young guys doing this. This was a man's work. This is pretty tough. And still a lot of that going on many years after most commercial rice had ended. Once commercial rice kind of comes to a close, you've got all of these wetlands that used to produce rice. What do you do with all that stuff? You have to reimagine. You're going to have to evolve. You're going to have to adapt to these changing economic conditions and figure out another way to carry on this progress. But one of the neat things they had up at Duralton Plantation, and Phil, I don't know who took this, but this is 1962. This is the mill pond right up in front of Duralton. And the mill pond was aptly named. What they did in this particular instance, they have a big rice field, but it's subdivided into 4 or 5 little compartments. This one right here is actually a reservoir. And they would draw water from the PD River on high tide, store it in this reservoir. Then on low tide, they would open up a little sluice gate, and this water would then rush out. And it turns this big undershot wheel, okay? So it runs on tidal power. Colonel Hunt built that tidal-powered rice mill out there. I think you found the stones, the actual grinding stones from that mill, and they're installed in the front gate of the entrance to Duralton Plantation, once again, courtesy of Mr. Wilkinson here. And they would later on convert some of these old water-powered rice mills into steam-powered rice mills. And this chimney you see is from one of, if not the very first steam-powered rice mills in the country. This is down on Cat Island. This particular chimney is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And one of the reasons they qualified as being one of the first, it was made entirely of handmade bricks. And if you look at many of these bricks, you can see the brick maker's finger indentations left behind as they're taking those soft, wet bricks out of the mold and setting them out to dry. From what I understand, in many cases, there's a young child doing this and likely don't think too much of their task. But these bricks have lasted more than 200 years. And so a lot of times we get visitors down there, especially young people. I have them come and put their fingers in those little finger impressions and help them kind of connect and think about what that lifestyle would have meant, and remind them that whatever task you undertake, you know, the evidence thereof might be visible 200 years later. So take good care in whatever you do. This is what this situation would have looked like with a steam-powered rice mill. This particular photograph is of the mill up at Chicora Wood before it was restored. And this is kind of what it looks like today. It looks like it's actually in need of another restoration. Pretty neat structure. Let me share with you quickly how this thing worked. The rice that had been harvested in the field and allowed to dry, brought to the mill, and either up a stairway or by a conveyor, comes up to the second floor where it's fed into what they call the beater box or the thresher. And it has these rotating wheels inside here called a rake. And what it does is that it removes the rice grains from the stalks, and then you see on the opposite end of that operation those empty stalks being expelled out, and then they're taken away and used elsewhere on the property. The rice falls down through here and is eventually picked up by this conveyor belt. Conveyor belt takes it up like 2 little handfuls at a time, back up to the top of the mill and deposit it slowly into the rolling screen, which creates friction. It's this friction as it goes through the rolling screen that loosens that outer hull, all right? And then the whole mix, the outer hull and the rice grains fall back down in front of the chaff fan. And what the chaff fan does is blow away the now lighter hulls, and what you're left with is that nice, clean product they called rough rice. And this is what they had, but nobody wanted that, so you had to figure out a way to get that down to the markets in Charleston. This is the interior of that mill up at Chicora Wood. It's my understanding a lot of that machinery has been removed and it's going to be resurrected over at Brook Green Gardens at some point in the future. But I got to take a close look at it before they began to remove that and reuse that building. This is what the rice barn up at Chicora Wood looked like. About 1910, Phil, we found these photographs while we were up there, and that's what it looks like today. It's been lovingly restored, resurrected, and once again, our good friends, Dr. Richard Porcher and Brian Judd, came up and allowed me to use illustrations from his book on the mechanization of rice culture here. And you see that the rice comes from the threshing barn that I showed you a picture of earlier by conveyor. It's almost 250 feet away, but this is moved mechanically into the storage barn, and then it comes down mechanically or then by gravity right on down into the waiting hold of the ship there. So a pretty ingenious technological advancement there to get that rice from the field through the mill and then on its way to market. This is what one of the polishing mills down in Charleston looked like. This is probably turn of the century or so. This is what it looks like today. Any of you familiar with the waterfront down in Charleston? The portion that you can see as you cross the Ravenel Bridge. See where the Carnival cruise ship ties up? That's where what remains of that rice polishing mill. It was right on that same dock where the ship piles up today. So just think of that sloop that picked up the rice at Chicora Wood can travel down to Charleston, tie up at that dock. They take the rice off that sloop, process it through the mill, and it's loaded back onto a ship on the same dock, which then takes it to the markets in Europe. It was a fairly involved process, but one that allowed Georgetown to become very prosperous over time. This is a scene at James Bennett's house. He was one of my ancestors, and he happened to host General Johnston at the end of the war between the states as he surrendered to Sherman. And this is, of course, when rice culture begins a decline, and economic conditions are changing. The whole slavery thing disappears, and people have to reimagine and adapt to the coming future here. They were still growing commercial rice on Cat Island well past 1910, but it ends probably before 1920. If you look at the federal census, the number of people working in rice in 1910 still constant, but by 1920 there's few, if any. It dropped off fairly quickly down there. So people found a way to reimagine these old rice fields, and up there at Duralton Plantation, a fellow moves in by the name of Thomas Samworth. And likely is not probably the only person that owned and operated a publishing company in Plantersville, South Carolina, and published a lot of books on ballistics and firearms and that sort of thing. 1961, incidentally, the year I was born, he decides that he will give his property that he has made great improvements on to the sportsmen of South Carolina, so that they can then enjoy the same place that he's been able to enjoy. When asked why he was giving his property away and not simply willing it to his daughters, and said if he gave it to his daughters, they would probably trade it for a Buick. And I've talked to the daughters, and they said he was probably right. And they're now, of course, they and their descendants glad that Mr. Sam did what he did. Phil, you remember this one. Mr. Sam was a frequent visitor of Phil's when he was down at Tom Yawkey South Island Plantation. And this is Mr. Sam. He's got his camera out there, and he modified Yawkey's Jeep so he could go out and take motion pictures of all the wildlife out there. We still have that camera, Phil. We've got two of them. One is up at Samworth. I got the other one down at the Yawkey Center. But Mr. Sam, although in his later years was almost totally blind, had a great vision of what these former rice plantations could be for the people of South Carolina, a great place where people could come and enjoy some of the same things that he had enjoyed. People told me, Phil, that Mr. Sam, if a visitor arrived, would immediately want to take them out in the woods just to see what was going on out there. And ride around in those fields and ride out on the river and see all the birds and get to know the place better. Just did good things for you to be outdoors like that. There was another part along our coast, just a little bit farther south. Captain Hugh Garden would be the founder of the Santee Gun Club. And this is a group of mostly wealthy northern industrialists who actually became really good stewards of these former rice fields. And these guys had a pretty interesting history, purchasing, consolidating the old rice plantation lands, and in many cases hiring the same people who had been stewards of this land for generations to now help care for it and operate it as a hunting preserve. When they first start the club, they're on a boat, and because they didn't have a place to stay, they would later build the lodge down there at Santee. It's still there today, although it's been modified a little bit and been preserved, I think, pretty carefully now. I had the pleasure in my career of working with these guys. This is Moses and Theodore and William. All of these guys had a rich family history living and working on the Santee Delta, deep appreciation of the value of all those natural resources down there. And this is part of their lifestyle. They don't just work on an old plantation. They don't just, take care of the rice fields. This is part of their legacy. That whole culture that came over from West Africa, still in these guys today. Mose is the one of these three that's still alive today. How old do you think Mose is, Phil? Do you remember? About 95 years old, and still going strong. Yeah, and he was in his late 80s, wasn't he? He was 90s as well? Yeah, so these guys lived a long and glorious life down there. Many of those early years, they're probably some of the poorest people in the state, but they didn't see themselves that way because of the wealth of natural resources that had been available throughout their lifetime. And all these guys, that were successful and lived into their 90s because of all the natural resources on those wetlands down there that they and their ancestors have been careful stewards of for many years. Just an incredible place, if you can imagine being a young man and taking people out in the dark to places like this, paddling those little duck boats mile after mile in all kind of weather conditions, but still one of the most popular duck hunting spots in all of the Southeast. So if you get a spot on a hunt at Murphy, you're a pretty lucky individual down there. One of the members of that gun club back then was this fellow. This is Edward Porter Alexander. He was General Alexander, actually attains the rank of Brigadier General well before his 30th birthday, almost unheard of in that time period. He would also purchase and consolidate some rice fields and rice plantations a little bit further up into Georgetown County, and would regularly host his friends on some duck hunts down there, including this fella. Most people don't recall what Grover Cleveland looked like, but this is him, and he's actually the one that puts Georgetown County on the map as a duck hunting destination. The reason we had ducks was because of all the rice that had been here. If you go back, first that wild rice was attracting lots of waterfowl, and then the cultivation of thousands and thousands of acres of rice drew more and more ducks as we went through time. And these wealthy northern industrialists, after the war, they start coming down, purchasing this land and rebuilding the infrastructure necessary to be able to host all these wintering waterfowl down here. And then in many cases also leaving their lands behind to the people of South Carolina. This fellow would have been a guest of General Alexander. This is William Yawkey. William Yawkey was the owner of the Detroit Tigers and loved to hunt. So he comes down as a guest of General Alexander, and he would bring along his favorite nephew. This is Tom Yawkey as a young fella. And Tom is pictured here with his mother and his stepfather. Stepfather dies when Tom is 12, mother when he's 15. He's orphaned at the age of 15, Hannah. And so Uncle Bill adopts him. 6 months after the adoption, Uncle Bill dies. And once again, this guy is looking for a family identity. He would find it in the people that lived on Cat Island. And by 1926, he is the owner of much of what we call the Tom Yawkey Wildlife Center today, and became a careful steward of this property over time, steeped in a rich family tradition of wildlife conservation, hunted, fished, spent a lot of time in the woods. It just came natural to him, and Phil has told me many times that Mr. Yawkey would get him in that Jeep and make him ride around and look at things day after day after day. And Phil sometimes didn't appreciate all the time that they spent in the woods, but in retrospect, we understand that Tom Yawkey kept a journal and carefully recorded everything that he saw along the way, Phil, what ducks or what pond and how many turkeys and how many deer. And he sits down and reads these journals, and this becomes the backbone of his management applications over time. Scientific observations led to a scientific plan to manage the property for the benefit of not only the waterfowl, but all of the different shorebirds. If you guys like stuff like this, you need to come down to the Yawkey Center. This is like every day during the winter we see stuff like this. Just a bird-a-palooza. It's just fantastic. And of course, if you get a bunch of waterfowl, you get a bunch of ducks down there, you tend to attract a bunch of eagles. We've got resident eagles. They're on the nest right now. Then we've got migratory eagles that are coming down off the Great Lakes, following these big flocks of ducks down there. It's not just about birds, though. There's a lot of other things that benefit from this careful stewardship and management of the land down there. There's migrants every season of the year, more in the winter perhaps, but it's not any more important if you happen to be one of the ones that come in the summer and get to utilize it as well. So that stewardship is just an amazing thing. There are some changes that take place along the way. So this is getting beyond rice culture, beyond the heyday of duck hunting. And by the 1930s, as the country was still moving right along with modernization and industrialization, only about a third of South Carolinians had access to electric power. So manufacturing and other things were lagging far behind the rest of the country. So they devised a plan to build a dam up on the Santee River, create this big hydroelectric plant. And as part of that project, they would shunt the water that had been coming down the Santee, the largest volume of fresh water in the state, over into the Cooper River. And without fresh water coming down the Santee, salt water moved up into that basin further than it ever had before. And those places that had one time been a cypress swamp had been developed into rice fields and then reimagined as a place for waterfowl, some of them reverting back to cypress swamp. But without fresh water, that situation would change. And those great cypress forests that were re-evolving, all of a sudden were gone once again. So we see change after change after change, but it's not the end of the road, as some people have imagined. We've got some more changes coming our way as well. And I can remember people, 15 years ago were saying, it's all over with. There's no way we can contend with all the changes that are coming. Sea levels rising, the ducks just don't come like they used to. May as well give it up. But there were some good thinking people that didn't give up, Judd, and instead they kept on. You can look at the past, and it's always neat and fascinating to do, but we can learn from the past and learn that all of those people that came before were forced to make adaptations. If they wanted to keep on making a living, if they wanted to keep being good stewards of land, they had to learn how to adapt. This is just a couple of years ago. I can't even remember which flood this was now, because there have been so many recently because of the changing climate. And it's real easy to say, it's all over with and we should give up. But I like the spirit of the people in Georgetown. I don't know who this guy is, but he said, business as usual. And this has to be the case. See, this is the hallmark of our species, is our ability and willingness to adapt to changing conditions. And this is why, Hannah, I think this is an unfinished story, because we've got an opportunity now to keep on with this tradition of good stewardship of the land. And we've got to make good decisions, and we need to make them rapidly, because we don't want to end up like this guy. Failure to adapt, 101, okay? Don't be that guy. Let's be the guy like Tom Yawkey, like Thomas Samworth, that faced adversity in their life, but continued to move forward, always trying to improve on a situation. And at the end of their chapters, of course, they leave a great legacy behind, and each one of us capable of that same thing. Thank you. Pretty good timing, right? Yeah. Yeah, if you've got some questions, I'll take them now if you like. If you want to meet with me later, we can do that as well. We got one in the back.
Jim, I know that the slaves came over in the bottoms of ships. How did they bring the rice with them?
I've heard this, and I don't know this for certain, but some of the first rice grains that come into South Carolina from West Africa had been woven into the hair of the African women. If you remember, they are the stewards of that seed rice, and seed rice was one of the most valuable things you could have. So wherever you ended up in the world, and they didn't know where they were going, but they knew if they brought that rice with them, they had a great chance of survival, or a greater chance of survival of someone that didn't. Great question.
That picture of the flood on Front Street.
Yeah.
When was that?
Well, like I said, I don't remember. Just pick one. 20, you want 2015, 2016, 2018, 2019? Yeah, and some of the people on Front Street, they probably can't tell which one it is either. And it was their buildings. They've gotten used to all that sandbagging and mopping up. I remember after this last one, that storm hit, Hurricane Ian hit on a Friday, Fred, and so I went down to the Yawkey Center. You know, the building's trashed. It's full of mud and water and stuff. Went down to Front Street after I'd made an assessment down at the Yawkey Center, and lo and behold, the stores are open. They're mopping the floors. Right back to business again, just after their buildings have been flooded. And that's the attitude that we have to have today. What's that?
Adaptation.
Adaptation, absolutely, absolutely. Allison.
I've seen pictures of during the heyday of the duck hunting and whatever, and the hunters would be there with like this mountain of ducks that they've shot.
Yeah, the 100 Duck Day, yeah.
My reaction is, you're wasting all those ducks. What are you doing with them? Did they use?
Yeah, they
all
did.
those ducks?
Yeah, they did. They would offer up a sumptuous feast for all the members of the club. They would distribute them to the families of the guides and the people that worked in the rice fields, the people that worked in the house, the people that did everything. Yeah, that harvest was realized, and that harvest was utilized.
Well, I'm glad to know.
Yeah. They didn't. It was a time where you didn't let things go to waste. You know, we showed that picture of the rice mill, and they're using the rice that they send to market, but they would get the rice dust, rice flour, and you could use that, what they call the broken pieces of rice, middlings. That was used to make feed for animals on the plantation. The rice straw went into the stalls where the horses and the oxen and mules bed down at night. So everything is utilized. It was just the way of life. You just didn't waste things. There was a use for everything. When you harvested a pig, for example, they used everything but the squeal. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is there any production of rice in South Carolina currently?
Yes, there is, and I almost forgot that because I didn't have it in my notes, and you see I don't have any notes, but I was just thinking about that this morning. There's a guy, Mr. Quattlebaum, up here where the Black and the PD River come together on the old White House plantation, and he has been successfully growing a product that looks almost exactly like this Carolina gold rice. And take a look at this gold rice before you leave. And he is now, from what I understand, also being able to mill his own rice. Talked with a fellow up at Clemson, Carthy, and he's very interested in seeing a resurrection of Carolina gold along the coast here. And this is really ambitious, given the projections of sea level rise. You're going to do what? When you know sea levels are coming up at extraordinary rates. But yeah, people willing to learn and adapt and try to do these things and keep this science, this art, this way of knowledge, keep it moving forward. There's others around the low country too. I visited Cypress Gardens not too long ago. It's where we did this plantation first. And a young fellow, a naturalist working over there, Gabe Schuler, he's growing rice in one little pond over there. They harvest the rice at just the right time of year, store it, let it dry, and then he's milling it by hand in front of their visitors there as we go through time. So keeping all these things alive in a lot of imaginative ways and sharing that with people. Yes, sir.
As point, that Carolina gold rice is terrific.
Yeah.
One of the best tasting rices I've ever eaten.
Yeah, and I've learned something about rice in recent years. Remember in the first part of the pandemic, you go to the store and there wasn't much on the shelf. Well, all of a sudden this rice product showed up. It was a short-grained rice called Rico, and it was the only thing there. So I figured, well, I may as well buy some. At least I'll have some rice to eat. I don't know how good it's going to be. I had my doubts about it. It's the best rice I've ever had, and it mimics not Asian rice, but African rice, a smaller, more pear-shaped, and it's got a greater, richer flavor to it. It lasts longer. You can make a pot of that rice and warm it up 3 days later, and it tastes the same as it did the first day you cooked it. Pretty neat stuff. So yeah, recognizing that these older grains, these heirloom products, probably better tasting and better for you. Yes, a lot of that stuff out there today. Yes?
Cat Island, South Island area, close to the ocean, all the water around them is salty water, but rice can't stand salt. Where did they get salt water?
The greatest volume of fresh water in the state was coming down that Santee River. And as it reached the coastal areas, it spread out far and wide. And that fresh water sometimes pushed right out into the breakers. They were able to grow rice right up to that primary dune line on some of those barrier islands there. It's just fantastic.
From the santee side and ditching it all the way across?
Ditching it right on up, just as far as they could. Yeah, that tidal influence, 4.5 feet, allowed you to push water a good long ways away from the actual channel of the Santee River. And still pushing a good bit today with recent rains. And the Santee River's been in flood fill, I think, for 3 weeks. So that's a lot of fresh water coming down all the time. And which is why you can ride out onto the Santee Delta and all those little creeks and sloughs and old rice canals and still see wild rice growing because of that volume of fresh water we still have today. Yeah.
One thing that changed, it was many dams from most corners of North Carolina.
Yeah. And that changed not only the flow of water, but also the flow of nutrients and minerals that come down. And this was essential to rice. This was essential to all of the waterfowl and all of the wetland-dependent species that were used in the rice fields or the former rice fields. All those nutrients and minerals also stopped at those dams and sinking down to the bottom of that lake. So we don't get as much of that as we used to get. But I can tell you this, that the Santee Delta is still one of the richest environments in the state. And we see evidence of that at the Yawkey Wildlife Center on all of those managed wetlands out there. Just unbelievable amounts of birds, and not just the ducks, but the ducks and the shorebirds and the eagles and the ospreys and all of that able to be there because of the minerals and nutrients still available in that soil, which creates perfect environment for all of these invertebrates. What does the early bird get? Worm, yeah. All of these invertebrates down there. And so that's at the lowest part of that whole food chain, the lowest part of the trophic level, very, very rich, and that translates all the way up to the top, where the eagles and alligators and us reside. Yes, ma'am.
January and February are still the best time to visit, see the
Absolutely.
birds?
Call soon.
Oh, that's what I was gonna ask. Are you still doing tours?
Absolutely. Doing more than 150 trips a year. All of these are free. We do trips, kind of an overview of the area. We also do trips for birders, photographers, people that like to get out and look at historic sites, people that just want to take a walk in the woods. We do annually several trips now for people who like to come out and paint what they see when they get out in the wild. There's a part of the Yawkey Center that Andrew Wyeth used to visit annually. And so we take people out and let them spend time where Andrew Wyeth did, hoping that they'll be inspired just as he was by that beautiful place. Anybody else?
If rice is going to be grown now, what kind of equipment is there to be used in it? Would it have to be physical labor, people going in and picking
Well,
and buying?
Well, typically what they've done is they've moved these operations away from these tidal areas to be most productive, where you can install a mechanical pump, which allows you to move that water much more efficiently and then not be subject to the whims of nature. And so that's how they're doing it today. They are using mechanized equipment to grow, to cultivate, and to harvest the rice, yeah.
Jimmy, want to mention the books that you have?
Yeah, there's a couple on the back table back there that I think might be of interest. One of the ones that I talked to you about up here was this New Voyage to Carolina. This, like I said, is one of my gospel, John Lawson's book. A companion to it, though, and also a pretty good read, is one called A Delicious Country. There's a fellow that retraces the route of John Lawson. So this 1,000-mile journey, he recreates and talks about the way things have changed along the way, but a really neat companion to this one back there. I've also got Doerr's book on rice and rice planting, which for many years was the gospel. Before we had the internet and all this stuff, Phil, that was one of the only resources that were available that you could look back. And this guy wrote the book in 1936, reprinted it in 70, but he includes diagrams of diamond gates. And to my knowledge, that's the only diagram of a diamond gate on planet Earth. And so a lot of neat methodologies and technologies that were a big part of rice culture back then dealt with in detail in that book. A really valuable volume. What else do I got back there? Oh yeah, unless I forget, and I owe a great deal of debt and gratitude to Dr. Richard Porcher down there in Charleston. He's given me free permission to use any and all part of that book about the mechanization of rice culture in South Carolina. If you're interested in things like this, that also needs to be in your library.
What was the plantation with the winnowing house?
That is Mansfield. It's just up on 701. It's operated as a bed and breakfast. And you tell them you're interested in looking at the property, the winning house, they'll probably let you come on in and take a look at it. But really neat property and being carefully managed.
Jim, it's also on the plantation. It's also on the plantation tour.
Yeah, regularly on that plantation tour that's held by the Prince George women each year. Yeah, so if you haven't ever been on that, you need to go see. You'll get a chance to see some of the properties here that normally are not available to the public. So really a great opportunity if you can get a hold of that. Coming up this spring, probably late March, I think. Yeah, yeah.
Really the weekend before you.
Yeah. No matter what it costs, it's worth it, okay? Do it, yeah. By the way, all the trips that I offer at Yawkey are free because of the generosity of Tom Yawkey. We don't charge anything for all those trips that we do, and it's absolutely magical. I mean, I've been with the department and worked on fantastic properties for 40 years, but Yawkey is by far the best of all of them that I've ever visited. So my thanks to Bob for an opportunity to share all this with you today.
Thank you, Jim. Very good.
Excellent presentation. I know you all enjoyed it as I did. Just to give you a little bit of an update as to what we're going to be doing, this is always, this Tuesdays With is always the third Tuesday of the month. And so next month, February 21st, Reverend Dr. Betty Dees Clark, who is the pastor of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church here in town, that church is celebrating its 160th anniversary this year. And she is going to be coming and sharing thoughts on the 160th anniversary of Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. I know you'll enjoy hearing her. Excellent speaker and very important part of our history here in Georgetown as well. Always the third Tuesday, as I say, we have a list of all the remaining events in March, April, and May, and I know you want to join us for those as well. Just a couple other events that are coming up. Our annual Friends of the Georgetown Library meeting is going to be held on Tuesday, February 28th. Hope you'll be able to join us. We'll have more information of that coming out on emails. Also, we have now twice a year community yard sales where we take the parking lot back here, the courthouse parking lot, and open it up for a community yard sale where you can come in at a very reasonable rate to get an area to be able to sell your stuff. We do all the marketing, advertising. You don't have to have people come on to your yard or your house, whatever the case might be. And it's a wonderful opportunity. Again, we'll be making an announcement about that. That's going to be on March 18th with a rain date of March 25th. Now, if you want to get to know all what we're doing as the Friends of the Georgetown Library, we send out emails regularly as to events. Just give us your email address. Join the Friends of the Georgetown Library. $12 for an individual, $20 for a family. And we have some of the membership forms back there right now. Again, I want to thank all of you for being here this morning, and I want to thank Jim once again for an excellent presentation. Thank you.